to Oregon, my alma mater, which I'm sure you had no role in the selection for the fire truck, but it doesn't hurt. And is Lauren Poulos, and her talk is interactions between prescribed fire and invasive grass, Brachypodium sylvaticum, in the Willamette National Forest in Oregon.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Can everyone hear me okay?
Okay.
All right, awesome. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you about some research that was funded by the U.S. Forest Service as well as the BLM. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with this grass, Brachypodium sylvaticum, it's also known as false brome, as its common name. So natively, it's found in temperate Eurasian regions, but as you can see from this map, and it's the like bright lime green here, it's really expanded worldwide. It's found kind of in a lot of different places. In particular, what it's doing in the United States here is it's been classified as a noxious weed pretty much all along the western coast, so California, Oregon, as well as Washington. It is a perennial grass and can persist in full sun as well as shady conditions, and it's this particular aspect here that's one of the things that's giving it a real competitive advantage over the natives in the field. Okay, so taking a look specifically at Oregon here, we can see through time the invasion really pretty aggressively expands. In 1939, we've got this one single population just outside of Eugene, and as we move forward in time, 2003, it's really quite expanded. Okay, so one of the reasons this is a real issue is it's creating these really thick, carpet-like monoculture, basically lawns in the forest. And our ecosystem, forest ecosystem, really hasn't evolved to have a lawn in it. So it's creating all sorts of a cascade of effects, decreasing dominant tree regeneration, decreasing biodiversity just in general, and really has the potential to alter the forest fuel structure and potentially the fire regime as well. And it's that particular point that I'm interested in with my own research. And so I would be taking a closer look at kind of fire in general and how it interacts with this grass. And this kind of falls out in two different ways. I'm interested in how the presence of Brachypodium pre-treatment actually affects fire. And I'll be looking at severity as well as intensity. And how to define those for my purposes. Severity, I'm sure everyone's familiar, but on the ground, actual results from the fire, so percent ash, percent char, also vegetation burned, so the actual on-the-ground effects, and then intensity being the just general physical release of energy by the fire, which I've measured through temperature. Okay, so does the grass's presence affect fire treatment? And on the flip side of that, I'm also really interested in, especially from a management position, can prescribed fire actually be used to control this grass? It might be something that could be potentially financially more feasible than herbicides, which can get expensive and also not so hot for the environment. Okay, so there's a few potential outcomes just walking into this right away. As we can see on this graph illustrated here, as we increase abundance of the grass, we might actually see an increase in severity and intensity. As I mentioned, this is a perennial grass, so it's going to senesce every fall, leaving a dead layer of thatch, which can potentially dry out and increase fire severity and intensity come burn season. So that's one thing that we might have seen with treatment. Conversely, because this grass does stay green so late into the fire season, and because grasses in general are known to have a high silica content, which actually reduces flammability, we might see a decrease in severity and intensity. So as you see here on the graph, increase in abundance, decrease in fire severity and intensity. So that's looking at what the grass is doing to the fire. Now on the flip side of this, or maybe a mirror image question, I guess, what are we able to do to the grass using prescribed fire treatment? It's possible that prescribed fire might actually increase your abundance of the grass as compared to controls. And this could be due to things like exposing the soil, reducing light levels, increasing light levels by a reduction in canopy, or increasing seed dispersal on the crews as well as the equipment out in the field. So that's one potential outcome. This is the one we're really hoping for, is that prescribed fire might decrease the abundance of the grass as compared with control plots by actually killing the established individuals in the field as well as potentially the seeds for the next year's germination. So this is the one we're hoping for. To set this up, the Forest Service allocated 2 sites, both within the Willamette National Forest, both of these sites, as you can see, they're a little bit different in layout and contour, but they've both been logged in the last 50 years, and this is something kind of important to note, that this grass is really attracted to disturbed sites. It's highly correlated with disturbance. So once it gets kind of a foot in the door with a logging incident, it can really just explode and very well establish itself. And that's what's happened in these sites. So this is kind of schematic of what the site looks like. Again, it's not true to the actual shape, but just so you can get kind of an understanding of how we did it. I have randomly selected half of the site for treatment with fire here in the red, and then left the other half as control here in the blue. Okay, so within these areas of treatment, your burn here, control here, I laid out transects lengthwise, and along these transects, I sampled the grass from 2 distinct plots. So they're here in the light green. These are my brachypodium plots. This actually has the grass present. And then also because I'm interested in how the grass is dispersing with treatment and through time, perpendicular to those, I have selected 2 plots without the grass in them at all. So those are my dispersal plots. And I've done that in each treatment area. So looking overall, again, the sites are a little bit different in shape, and these are just schematics. But for each transect, I have the 2 brachypodium plots, the 4 dispersal plots, giving me for each site a total of 16 plots with the grass, 8 burned, 8 left as control, 32 dispersal plots, half burned, half control, with a total sample size of 96 plots. Again, half burned, half control. Okay, so that takes us to the fire treatment. The fires were set on June 22nd in the first site and July 10th in 2011. For those of you that aren't familiar with Oregon weather, this is actually a spring burn. And this year in particular was really wet and late. So this last burn was, I believe, the last prescribed burn that the Forest Service actually had that season. So I was really lucky to get to do this at all. Something to keep in mind, ecologically, I probably would think that a late summer burn might have a little bit more effect on the grass, but because this is, these are valuable forests, it's a timber forest. So a high severity fire is a high risk fire, potential for wildfire, and it just was a risk that we couldn't take. So keeping that in mind, you might find a little bit different results with a different timing of treatment. And mine was, again, a spring treatment with the fire. Okay, so in designing this experiment, I made sure to get some pre and post burn data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. I got percent covers by plot. Again, these plots were meters squared. And here I've got percent of Brachypodium sylvaticum, or the grass. You can see a little fire right here. And then wood, percent cover of wood, other vegetation besides the grass, and then pretty much whatever's left, ground and rock. And as you can see here, pre-fire in the darker red versus post-fire, you really see consumption of everything out there with an increase in what's left of the ground and rock, which makes good sense. Excuse me. All right, so breaking down the wood a little bit further, I've got percent covered here of our different fuels classifications, and these measurements were taken directly preceding the treatment and directly following, so day of treatment, to try and see potentially what types of fuels are driving the fire. So your 1 hours are basically to 1/4 inch, 10 hours are your 1/4 inch to 1 inch, 100 hours are your inch to 3 inch in diameter wood, and then this is 3 inch and above diameter wood, so these are your heavies. You got your finer flashy fuels, and as you can see, the types of fires that we were having out there, you really didn't get a whole lot of consumption of the heavier fuels, but you did get a lot of the finer flashies going up. All right, so in addition to the percent covers by plot, we went out and did kind of a visual estimate of burn severity using the National Park Service scale, which is a little counterintuitive because 5 is the lowest level of severity. And then as you decrease the numbers, you increase the level of severities for the highest level of severity being 1. So 5 is basically our plots that had fire put down but didn't really have a whole lot of visible effects of like char or ash or burning at all, really. Okay, so to take a look at intensity, and with a limited budget, I decided to play with temperature-sensitive paints, and this was pretty cool. So each of these paints sensitive to one temperature, and I selected a range of 7 and used them to kind of, so when each paint level is exposed to that temperature to which it's sensitive, it will exhibit a color change or go from matte to glossy texture. And so it's a little bit like reading tea leaves, but it gives you a good catalog of the types of temperatures that are being exhibited in the field. And so this is a copper tag. I have a protective one on top that kind of folded over. I put one flush with the ground level and then suspended one about 20 centimeters above. And I replicated this twice in each plot, giving me a total of 4 tags per plot. And this is in Celsius also, with like 79 degrees my lowest, capping out at 816. Okay, and a couple more things that I made sure to look at was canopy covered by plot as well as slope. And here, just to make note, this is one of my sites pre and post burn. And you can really see, again, I mentioned that it was logged with a lot of data down here, and the burn, we got some areas to go with some nice severity, but it was mostly patchy, which is natural for this region. Okay, so before even considering treatment, my sites were very different already. So as you notice here, site 2 is significantly higher in things like canopy cover, as well as other vegetation, as well as the actual grass cover. So it was important to control for these environmental variables when trying to see the actual effect that grass is having. So for my statistical model, I made sure to control for all the environmental variables that were significant and distilled out just the effect on the grass. So, and what I found was for intensity, we've got our temperature here and our percent cover of Brachypodium sylvaticum, found a very significant effect where in increasing areas of abundance, you actually saw a decrease in the temperature exhibited by the fire. So it's having a dampening effect on the temperatures at the plot level. For severity, I repeated the same analysis and I didn't really find a significant effect with a P of 0.35. I don't really know why this is. The only thing I can think of is that there are other things that are much more important when thinking about severity, like the rate of spread, the amount of time that the fire actually spent in the plot is a big one. So that might be why we don't see a significant effect for the grass on burn severity. Okay, so that addresses the what is the grass doing to the actual fire. Now, again, from a management perspective, really interested to see what the fire is doing to the grass over time. So looking overall, does treatment have an effect on Brachypodium sylvaticum? So on this axis, we've got least squared means, which is basically a statistical stand-in for percent cover of Brachypodium. It's going to trend in the same direction. And down here, you've got time. So I sampled in the fall of 2010. Our fires were set in the spring of 2011. 2011 again here in the fall, another round of data collection. For my last one happening this fall of this year. And overall, I really did not see a significant effect of treatment with fire on Brachypodium. But breaking this down and looking at it in parts, so intensity is really trending that way. We've got a P of 0.06. And this is the change in percent cover of Brachypodium sylvaticum, so from 2010 to 2012. How did the grass's percent cover change? Based on the plots, this axis here is temperature, so the plots that exhibited 0% temperature, 800 degree temperature, and we saw a trend, but it wasn't actually significant for intensity. The interesting stuff really started to happen when I looked at severity of treatment affecting Brachypodium, and I found that indeed it does. So there's a lot going on this graph. Again, here this axis is percent cover, or stand-in for percent cover. You've got down here time. So if you'll notice, each of these color-coded lines here correspond to a class of severity. So 1 is the highest level severity, which is your red, moving all the way down to the cooler colors, light blue being our low severity, and the purple line here is the controls. So what I noticed immediately on this graph, when you look at your low severity plots, they're burning the worst. Apparently they're starting out with a little bit more Brachypodium, but again I mentioned that this really, I didn't find a significant effect on percent cover on severity. But on your low severity plots, you actually see an increase in the grass over time. looking at the polar opposite here, the thing to me is if you can actually get a high enough severity fire, you might potentially be able to control for this grass, which is really exciting. But when you think about the risk that if you can't get it high enough severity, if you just get a low severity fire, you might actually increase the abundance of this aggressive invasive. So another thing that I look at when I'm notice when I look at this graph is if you compare 2010 and 2011, the actual percent cover, outside of maybe this, it's really not changing a whole lot. There's something going on between fall of 2011, just post-treatment, and 2012. So we had a growth season here is where the differences really start to fall out in between the severity levels. So what that is pointing to me would be there's something going on with germination. And indeed, when you look at treatment affecting germination, you see a very significant effect with the burn plots having a much reduced rate of germination as compared with the controls. And again, breaking this down by severity, you do see the same trends here. The highest severity plots, practically no germination there. And as you reduce the level of severity, you get significant increases in germination, with the controls being significantly different from all 5 of these as a group, doing a multiple comparison, with, of course, a higher germination rate. So just to also throw that out there, intensity did not statistically have a significant effect on germination, although it's trending that way with a P of 0.16. Okay, so again, this is really kind of exciting to find out, at least, that from a management perspective, you could use treatment with fire to potentially control this grass. What I would really be interested in seeing is what goes on next year, and maybe what happens with repeated treatment over time. Okay, so just to kind of bring everything together that I've talked about so far today, areas with high abundance of brachypodium have lower intensity fires. Again, making note that this is a spring burn. Had we done maybe a later year burn, late nation. So even if you're not able to reduce the cover of the individuals in the field, you could at least be reducing the output for next year. Okay, so future directions, I'm not quite done before I walk away from this research project. I'd also like to take a look, as I mentioned, at how this grass is dispersing over time. So that'll be the next thing I look at. And then overall, I'd like to know how treatment is affecting the vegetative community. So maybe someday I'll get to talk as well as BLM for funding, as well as the long list of people who helped me in the field. All right, and with that, open up to questions. Yeah.
So with the spring burn, this year's grass was green and luscious and all that kind of stuff. So what was carrying the flame? Last year's grass and then the logging debris?
So as I mentioned, and both sites were really different. One of the sites in particular had a lot of deadened down and dried fuels, and they both had a decent representation of like finer fuels. So that was really what was driving the fire.
But the activity fuel from the logging or just previous year's vegetation or both?
I'm pretty sure it had mostly to do with the logging fuels. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know much about the natural fire history at these sites and if vegetation there is dependent or how it grows with fire?
Right. I know it's a mixed severity fire out there, but I don't really know. Yeah.
Did you record litter and dove measurements?
I did. I have duff consumption, and I didn't present that data here because I haven't really had time to mess with it. But yeah, using a nail, I recorded the amount of duff consumed in the fire, but I didn't have pre-treatment measures on duff or litter levels.
And just anecdotally, did you notice higher germination in areas where there's just bare soil after the fire?
I have been noticing germination both in the controls as well as the fire-treated plots in some of the bare soil areas, but the germination is just much higher in the controls, and it's actually dispersing into plots that wasn't present at previously. So that's going to be really interesting when I can finally take a look at that data too. Yeah.
One of the questions, I see that your test areas, you said you did them in the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Shake everything up, get a dog, brush it out, because that's...
Burn your shoes, burn your dog.
Oh my god, shave the dog if anything. But yeah, so it's also being moved by just recreation, because it's along the park trails and things like that.
Okay.
I don't know much about this particular grass, but is there potentially a threshold effect where, like, once it reaches a certain abundance level, it just takes off faster anyway? So that one area where there's higher abundance to start and the low severity does not really take off. It just
Yeah, that might
wouldn't be done
be.
anyway.
That's a good point. I wouldn't be surprised if that was what was going on. Because, yeah, one of the sites is just, they're very different in brachypodium cover as well as other environmental variables, but in one of my sites, the much more dense site, you can't walk through it without brachypodium seeds just exploding everywhere. So in that sort of density, any sort of movement is going to create a huge amount of dispersal of the plant. So I bet there's something going on there, yeah.
Were the burns done before seed set or before setting
Yes,
flower?
actually, so the seeds are made on the plants until late summer.
Yeah.
So I am having to, I assume that they were at least developing because we did see such a reduction in germination. And they do stay on the plant until late summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That aerial photograph, what was going on with that unit that looked like a cornfield?
Let me see if I can get
It's
back
an
there.
orchard,
Yeah, yeah,
a seed orchard.
for the replantings, right? Oh, there we go. Yeah,
Wow.
this
It's
is
a
the orchard.
plantation basically.
And you guys burned it last year, right? Or part of it?
And the grasses.
This one I get lost in. This is the really seriously dense brachypod. I can't even, it was hard to find the plots through the grass in the ferns sometimes. Any other questions? All right, great, thanks guys.
Okay, well, that concludes this session of the special session.